nay, 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 nay.
Since the beginning, our people have been wrestlers with God. The Torah tells the story of Jacob, the grandson of Judaism's founding couple, Abraham and Sarah. It says that one night he lay down to sleep in a lonely place along a riverbank and awoke suddenly to find himself locked in physical combat with a mystery opponent. All through the night they struggled back and forth, neither one able to definitively get the upper hand. Just as dawn was about to break, Jacob's adversary finally reveals itself to be an angel, a messenger of God. The angel then gives Jacob a new name, one that he'll be known by for the rest of his life. In this moment, Jacob becomes Yisrael, Israel, meaning one who has wrestled with God. It's so fascinating to me that this name, more than any other, has come to define Jewish identity. We're not typically called the children of Abraham, and we're never called the children of Moses. But since our inception as a people, we have been Bnei Yisrael, the children of Israel, the God wrestlers. Each of the three Western monotheisms has a name that comes from a verb in relationship to God. Muslim means one who submits to God. In the word Christian, the IAN suffix means to follow. So a Christian is one who follows Christ or follows God. We're Yisrael, the ones who wrestle with God. Submit, follow, wrestle. These are three profoundly different orientations toward faith. Not one is necessarily better or worse, but a God who seeks our submission or who sets a path for us to follow is very different than a God who invites us to be a wrestling partner. In nearly a decade of working with people who are in the process of becoming Jewish, no single idea in Judaism has been more consistently compelling to them than this. And I think the reason for that is because it's just so honest. Whether we feel we can admit to it or not, we all wrestle with God. We all have questions and struggles and doubts. Life is hard, full of so much grief and uncertainty sometimes. Even for those of us who call ourselves believers, we need to acknowledge that sometimes we get mad at God, and sometimes we feel really distant, and sometimes we don't know if we believe at all. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, one of the giants of modern Orthodox thought, talks about moment faiths. No one, he says, is good with God every minute of every day. Instead, faith comes and it goes, like the sun periodically breaking through on a cloudy day. The difference between a believer and a non-believer is not certainty, but frequency of faith. And of course, Judaism is unique among the other Western religions in that it's not only possible to be an active, practicing Jew who doesn't believe in God, it's actually quite a popular option. Some studies suggest that more than a third of American Jews consider themselves to be both proudly Jewish and also an atheist or an agnostic. To speak personally for a moment, I was raised in one of those homes. We lit Shabbat candles every week, were deeply involved in our synagogue, celebrated all of the Jewish holidays, but I don't remember a single conversation in my childhood about God. It just wasn't a topic that came up. It was actually only when I was already in rabbinical school that one of my professors pulled me aside and kindly explained to me that if I was going to be a rabbi, I should probably figure out what I believed. Given all of this, it's not surprising that Judaism has never created a single, universally accepted creed or dogma that everyone's expected to sign on to. Instead, I think of the history of Jewish theology as a record of thousands of years of nonstop God wrestling. This has yielded remarkable wisdom and piercing insight into the nature of the divine. And that wisdom is the legacy left to us to inspire our own ideas about God. And what a diverse and amazing legacy it is. The Torah presents us with a God who's quite anthropomorphic, quite human-like, full of love and frustration and jealousy and regret. God walks in the Garden of Eden, appears to the patriarchs and matriarchs in their dreams, and squabbles with Moses like they're an old married couple. The Bible's God can be profoundly compassionate in one moment and almost cruel in another, making mistakes and learning from them, and is by far the Bible's most complex and three-dimensional personality. That could not be more different than the God described by Judaism's great medieval philosophers, like Moses Maimonides. Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, rails against the slightest hint of anthropomorphism. For him, God has no shape and no form, and certainly no human-like emotions or capacity for change. He argues that the Bible's depictions of a God who rescues us from Egypt with a strong hand and a mighty arm, and who sits atop a glorious throne, are like the images from children's stories that depict talking flowers and trees and animals. They're meant to instruct and inspire, but they should never be taken literally by a grown-up. For Maimonides, God is the active intellect at the core of the universe, much more like Aristotle's unmoved mover than Genesis's companion to Abraham and Sarah. In stark contrast to the human-like God of the Torah or the rationalist God of Maimonides, the Hasidic mystics of Eastern Europe adopted almost a sort of pantheism, understanding God as being in all things at all times. One of their favorite verses from the Torah is Ein od milvado. There is none other than God. But they understand it a little bit differently. There is nothing other than God. Every tree and flower, every man and woman, everything we see or touch or experience, they say, are all parts of the all-encompassing divine oneness. The past century has witnessed a wide variety of Jewish theologians, each expressing their own unique take on God. Buber located God in the power of deep human relationships. Heschel talked about finding God in moments of radical amazement in nature. Soloveitchik thought that we come to know God best through the practice of halakha, of Jewish law. Harold Kushner describes a limited God who doesn't cause life's unfairness and our suffering, but instead accompanies us and grieves with us when it takes place. In recent decades, voices of those who had traditionally been left out of the conversation, voices of women and LGBTQ folks, have widened our perspective and challenged old theological notions of gender and power. As more books on Jewish theology are being published every year, and the tent widens to include the contribution of all of us, we benefit from the challenging, remarkable, and inspired wisdom of so many teachers and fellow God wrestlers. In a famous commentary on the moment of revelation at Mount Sinai, the Talmud teaches that each Israelite who heard God's voice that day heard it just a little bit differently than their neighbors. Each one of them, they explain, heard God lefi kocho, according to their uniqueness. We all hear and understand and wrestle with God a little bit differently. And Judaism says that isn't a problem to be overcome. That's actually exactly the way it's supposed to be. As we each unpack this legacy of God wrestling that goes all the way back to our ancestor Jacob and engage in it on our own terms, we're faced with more questions than answers. As Rabbi Daniel Ruttenberg, a really important contemporary author and thinker, wrote, "My theology is, I don't know." We must engage with God, she says, with humility and with the awareness that things are going to be messy and complex as we try to make sense of ultimate reality. Can I get an amen?
Yay, nay, nay, nay. Yay, nay, yay, nay. Yay, nay.